Okay, so hello, welcome to Ghost Town. We are going to talk about Harriet Jacobs today and her autobiography, which is called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And let's go ahead to the next slide. There's a video that we're going to watch. It's about 13 minutes long, and it will explain the story to us. So let's go ahead and watch this.
It was the age of cotton, a time when a third of all Southerners lived in bondage, an era of extraordinary wealth sustained by unimaginable brutality. In the 1850s, Harriet Jacobs began to pen an autobiography she would call Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She would become the first woman to write a slave narrative. Published works written by African Americans who had escaped lives of bondage. At a time when state laws in the South made it a crime to teach the enslaved reading and writing, Harriet would use her words to reveal the awful truth of American slavery. Her story begins in the coastal town of Edenton, North Carolina, where she was born in 1813. Harriet's first owner had ignored the law and taught her to read and write. After she died, Harriet was willed to the 3-year-old daughter of Dr. James Norcom. 12 years old, with light skin and dark eyes, Harriet became a house slave. She was to cook and clean and serve the wishes of the mistress and the master.
Even the little child will learn that if God has bestowed beauty upon her, it will prove her greatest curse.
Harriet Jacobs calls slavery a cage of obscene birds. Harriet says that no matter what the slave girl looks like, if she's dark, if she's light, if she's medium, if she's at all attractive, if she has beauty, it's a curse, because the master will be after her.
Dr. Norcom was a man widely admired in the community. He took an unmistakable interest in his new house slave, a girl 40 years his junior.
My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. He peopled my young mind with unclean images, such as only a vile monster could think of. He met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing by heaven and earth that he would compel me to submit to him.
She's just completely drowning in this harassment and in this sexual situation. He doesn't want to force her. He wants to convince her. He wants to control her. He wants to control her mind. She says, "My master had money and power on his side. I had a determined will. There is might in each." Wonderful line. So she's in a war, and really from the time she's 12, 13, 14, she understands it, because she isn't his victim. She's his enemy.
Harriet knew that the doctor was the father of 11 slave children.
Norcom had many children outside of his legal marriage. And what Harriet tells us, that he tended to sell the children off.
The practice was not unusual. Mulattoes, wrote a slaveholder's wife, are as common as blackberries.
The rates of interracial children being born may have actually been higher then than any time since.
So no white man ever had to feel like he was in fact raping a black woman if he took her against her will. In fact, if you look through the court records, you will find that the judges often say there is no such thing as the rape of a black woman. The courts do not recognize it.
At 15, Harriet believed she had finally found her rescuer, Samuel Treadwell Sawyer. The 30-year-old lawyer was from one of North Carolina's most important families.
He says that he's concerned about her. How does she feel? Imagine you're 15 years old and a charming young man, I mean, he's not so young, he's twice as old as she is actually, he's almost 30, comes and expresses concern. I am your friend, he says. You know where that goes.
Harriet was convinced that a man of such power and influence would be able to free her.
It is a Hollywood dream more than a century before Hollywood. But it had happened to another young woman in the town, and she knew the story, and the whole town knew the story of Roelke Barris and how she had really managed to get her young master to fall in love with her. And he had in fact freed their children, and he had in fact freed her, and he had in fact even freed her mother. So there was a model for this wild alternative.
Within a year of starting her relationship with Sawyer, Harriet gave birth to a son. By law, her child was owned as she was by Norcom. For Harriet Jacobs, life under Norcom's grip would become intolerable and far more complicated. At 19, she gave birth to another child by Sawyer, a daughter. Sawyer offered to buy the children. Norcom not only refused, he wanted revenge.
Norcom is threatening to send her children to a plantation of his that's known for brutalizing slaves. Harriet uses the word brutalizing, that's what we would call traumatizing. And when she speaks of what happens to people, their hearts get broken, their psyches get broken. They're not themselves afterwards.
Slowly, the realization came. If she were gone, Norcom would relinquish the children. The only way to save her children was to leave them. In 1835, Harriet fled into nearby swamps until her grandmother, a free woman living in Edenton, arranged for a more permanent hideout. Soon after, Harriet was secreted away in a tiny space beneath the roof of her grandmother's house. Harriet's world would now shrink to a space 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet high.
If you take a very large library table and get under the library table, that's the kind of space that you're talking about.
Rats and mice ran over my bed. I was restless for want of air. The atmosphere was so stifled that even mosquitoes would not condescend to buzz in it. I suffered for air even more than for light.
She suffers from heat, she suffers from cold. From time to time, she can come down and walk around a little bit, but she's under house arrest, basically.
She was literally a prisoner who made herself a prisoner, and I guess that's how she did it. She survived as prisoners do.
Within weeks, Harriet learned that Sawyer had bought the children and was sending them to live at her grandmother's house. Still, Harriet continued to live a secret existence, just a floor apart from her children.
The thing that holds her back is her devotion to her children. And that was, for a lot of slave women, the thing that kept them from running away. There were a great deal more male runaways, and the typical runaway was a young male who didn't have children. For slave women, they just didn't want to run away without their children.
Days days slipped into months, months into years. Harriet filled her time writing, reading, and sewing.
She describes some psychotic episodes. She talks about hearing voices, and she talks about seeing things, and she talks about passing out, and they have to bring her to.
She bore a tiny hole through one of the walls. On occasion, she could catch a glimpse of her children playing nearby, comforting herself in the knowledge that she had freed them from Norcom's hold.
Countless were the nights that I sat late at the little loophole, scarcely large enough to give me a glimpse of one twinkling star. Season after season, year after year, I peeped at my children's faces and heard their sweet voices, with a heart yearning all the while to say, "Your mother is here."
I think that her psychic strength reflects that of all slave women, because slavery demanded a different kind of womanhood. It demanded that people be self-reliant. It demanded that they try to do everything that they could to protect themselves. But she has the strength and resilience that African American women had to develop to survive slavery.
In 1842, Harriet Jacobs had lived in her cramped, dark space for almost 7 years.
It appeared to me as if ages had rolled away since I entered upon that gloomy, monotonous existence. My friends feared I should become a cripple. Had it not been for the hope of serving my children, I should have been thankful to die. Dark thoughts passed through my mind as I lay there day after day. I tried to be grateful for my little cell, and even to love it as part of the price I had paid for the redemption of my children.
Now, after all those years of confinement, Harriet's secret was about to be exposed. A neighbor's untrustworthy slave had stumbled upon Harriet's hideaway. A ship captain, known for smuggling runaways, offered to help. Off the coast of Edenton, arrangements were made for Harriet's escape.
I was on deck as soon as the day dawned. I watched the reddening sky and saw the great orb come up slowly out of the water. Soon the waves began to sparkle and everything caught the beautiful glow. I had never realized what grand things air and sunlight are till I had been deprived of them.
So that gives you background. Yeah. You guys have any questions or comments or?
Where did she go?
She went to, I think she ended up in New York. And then, yeah, she escaped to New York. And then her children were sent by the father to stay with her. So they all went to New York, which is a free state. And then she worked as a nanny for this couple and was able to educate her children, things like that. And then she worked on her story because she had, she had kept notes about all this. And then she wrote it, but there was a bishop who encouraged her to get it published. And she, was afraid. Of course, it's a story nobody wanted to hear. Nobody wanted to hear about what happened to the women that was different than the men, or about the sexual abuse and harassment. And even abolitionists were made very nervous by this story. And so finally, she found an editor, Lydia Maria Child, who was a published author of the time, And so she helped her get it published. She revised the manuscript a little. She said, this is the editor, she said, at her request, I have revised her manuscript, but such changes as I have made have been mainly for purposes of condensation and orderly arrangement. I have not added anything to the incidents or changed the import of her very pertinent remarks. With trifling exceptions, both the ideas and language are her own. I had no reason for changing her lively and dramatic way of telling her own story. And she said she changed about 50 words. And of course, people at the time didn't want to believe that she had written it herself. So there was, a lot of controversy about that. The slaves aren't supposed to read and write. They aren't supposed to tell their stories. And so by getting this author's assistant, she was able to get this story published. And of course, then she ended up working in the abolition movement and working with Frederick Douglass, which I guess we can go ahead. Yeah. Okay, so this is an image of Norcom, and she calls him Dr. Flint in her book. But that's the man who said that he was in love with her. This is what, from his perspective, he was in love with her. He wanted her to submit to him. Okay, and so he did not rape her, although he could have, and he felt like, he was being really good to her because he wanted it to be consensual. But he was obsessed with this woman, and wouldn't relinquish her until finally she ran away, and then, he sold her children to their father, right? And he turned out not to be such a great guy. He married a white lady who didn't want to deal with his, black children, and which worked out okay for Harriet and her children. Will you go to the next one? This is Lydia Maria Childs, who helped edit and get the work published. And she was a good friend of Harriet's, had a lot of respect for her. And I think they both were, worked together to get this story out. And they were, abolitionists. So here's, on the left is the book Harriet wrote, and on the right is a book about the letters. Okay, so I've read the one on the left. The one on the left is available at Amazon. It's also available at Gutenberg.org for free. If you want to find it there, it's very compelling read. It pulls you in, and you just, it's just astonishing what a good writer she was and how appalling the story is. And then, of course, the other one is probably more scholarly about her, which I'm going to read, but I haven't yet. Okay, and so after she was free, and after the Civil War, she and her daughter actually started 2 schools. This is one of the schools that they started. And Frederick Douglass was doing the same thing, starting schools, because the idea was you have to teach people so they can raise themselves up. Okay? And so she worked till the end of her life on projects like this, helping fugitives, helping former slaves recover, helping their children, deal with the trauma and getting an education. And she also wrote, this is Frederick Douglass, and she wrote for his paper. Also, she was involved in working on his paper, which was an abolitionist paper. He also wrote an amazing autobiography. Has anybody read that one? Great writer, amazing orator. And one of the things I want to say about these, I've read multiple slave narratives, and there are also some Native American stories are really interesting too from the same time period. But the stories, this man was actually the child of his master. So his mother had been raped. He was a child of rape. He never met his mother. His grandmother raised him for a while. He had a really hard time. He paid little white boys to teach him how to read. He would steal, or get some food and give it to the little white boy for a lesson in town because it was illegal. He would have been killed if they knew that he could read and write. Anyway, the 2 stories, or all these stories, are actually inspiring, just like Anne Frank's story is, except they escaped and were able to live into old age, unlike Anne Frank. but it's, you know, the same sort of thing. Somebody who suffered incredibly, overcame enormous odds, and then were able to go on and help other people, you know, and improve things. And the reason that I wanted to share her book in particular is because nobody's read it, and it's an American classic, you know, and it shows what happened to slaves, what happened to women slaves, which is something people don't like to look at. When you think of slavery, you think of the guy whose back's all, you know, scarred with whips, and you think about guys in the cotton fields. It was supposed to be better to be a house slave, but if you were a house slave, then you were also a sex slave, most of the time, unfortunately. And so that's something, this is not only a story about slavery, but it's also a story about sexual abuse and, you know, what women had to go through. So here are some, here's one of her quotes that we decided to close with, which I think is really strong. And I think it's true. There are no bonds so strong as those which are formed by suffering together. You know, suffering does bind us to each other. So that's my presentation. Do you want to like put your picture back on? So I just wanted to present that to everybody. I hope you take the time to read it. You know, find the book, read her story. North Carolina has a museum dedicated to her, and they have a lot of information about her at the University of North Carolina. And so I just want to recommend this to everybody. This is a story that needs to be read. So questions, comments? Emily, Amy, are you familiar with this book?
I wasn't familiar with it, but thank you so much for presenting this. There's just so much information we need to know, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm disappointed I didn't know about it because my American history teacher in college required us to read biographies and autobiographies, and then I think back and it was all male centric, and it was, you know, this was an opportunity that, but I'm probably an uncomfortable topic that he didn't want to address.
Right. Yeah. It is very difficult to talk about, but now with the Me Too movement, you know, people are hearing, and I think this is an important aspect of slavery that we need to think about. You know, the fact that once the slave trade was abolished, or, you know, made illegal, and you had a situation where people wanted more slaves, and so the way you got more slaves was by raping your women slaves, and then you would have these lighter children, and they were worth more, you know, and that was common practice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we want to say, oh, not all slave owners were like that. True, not all, but it was business. This was a business model. Slavery was really profitable in so many ways, and this is one of the worst. Yeah, so I just wanted to share it with everybody. I think people should be required reading for everything in America.
This is a comment, just a tangent comment, because it talks about starting the schools after the Civil War. There was a few years ago, and I'm sure it can be found online, a PBS special about education after Civil War for Black people, and then the founding, the evolution into the founding of historically Black colleges. And even talking about the split within the community of were you going to educate these children of slaves, some former slaves, were you going to educate them to be workers? And there were Black leaders that went down that path.
Right.
Or were you going to eventually, at the turn of the century, create strong intellectual education in some of the colleges? And so it was a tremendous special because it talked into that whole period of time after slavery and starting of education and here.
Oh, totally, yeah, they tried to prevent it. Didn't fund
And
schools.
who is the, it's so terrible, but the African-American man that had so much to do with agricultural education in the Southeast?
Well, that would be Frederick Douglass.
Was it Frederick Douglass?
Yeah, he founded Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, and so there were two trains of thought
Right.
about higher education for African-Americans.
Right.
For the former slaves.
Right.
It was very interesting. And this PBS special then went all the way through into the 60s and 70s.
Where the split is still going on.
Yes.
Yes, and it's still an issue now. I'm glad you brought that up.
And the other part of it is that as a white person, even if you have been exposed and educated for years, you don't really, I didn't understand all about the story of white folks. And all of a sudden it's there. And
Yeah, there was Frederick Douglass, and when he started the school, they made bricks. The first students made bricks to build the buildings. Like that's the first thing they learned. And then once they had buildings, then they could go on to other topics. But it was all about training people to be able to support themselves and raise themselves up. With the idea that once you had proven that you were okay, then you would be accepted. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first black man to graduate, well, he actually didn't graduate from Harvard. He had to go to Germany to get his doctorate. But he was an intellectual. He was raised in the North. He was always free. He didn't realize that he was black until he went to school. And, you know, the other kids made fun of him and stuff. But he was the guy who said, no, we have to do more than just teach people how to raise their own food and build their buildings. We've got to give them intellectual development so that they can, you know, understand European culture and read the classics and all that. So you had, from the start, you had these two different pathways. And what happened was during the 60s then, and that continued all through historically until now, but you had Martin Luther King choosing the path of Frederick Douglass, nonviolence, proving ourselves, raising ourselves up. And then you had Malcolm X going the way of W.E. Du Bois, saying, no, we've got to, you know, like use our intellects to do this. The white man is never going to recognize that we're equal, right? And so you still have that going on in the protests now. You know, how did women get the right to vote? They had to protest, and some of them died. Yeah, they went to jail, and they were force-fed. Nobody gave them the right to vote. They couldn't vote to give themselves the right to vote, you know, and then it was the same way with African Americans, the same way with Native Americans. We've got this idea that's so Eurocentric, you know, and these kinds of voices have been ignored. It is a really interesting issue to think about because, you know, you have these historically black colleges. You know, when I was in high school in the 70s, we had integration in Dallas. And they just bust kids in from projects into this, you know, rich white school. It was horrific. Kids were getting beaten up, you know? It was a joke. I mean, as far as kids learning something, you know? And I was one of those dopey white girls who signed up to take Black History class. It was all a bunch of little white girls, and we would be reading Khalil Gibran before class and stuff like that. And then there were two black guys in the class, and they used to come in before class and smoke pot. And then when the teacher got there, she would smell it, And she would get upset, and she went to the principal, and of course they left, you know. And so the principal, that was when you could smoke on campus, cigarettes and stuff. But, you know, and that happened over and over again, and this lady never got on top of it. We never learned anything in that class because, like now, you had teachers having to deal with a situation that they weren't trained for, they didn't know how to deal with, they weren't getting any support, you know. And who knows? Yeah, I guess I could go on and on about this. Do you guys have other questions or comments or? Well, anyway, that's all. I could go on and on, but I don't want to bore you. I would like you to get a hold of this book and have a read. It's a really good story. It's well written. You've heard some of her quotes. She's a good writer. And it's a story that everybody needs to know, especially now. Thank you.
I would be, I will order the book. And I'm wondering if there might be some interest in discussing the book as, you know, as more of us have read it and just having an open discussion around it.
I would love to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind ordering several of them. I just looked on Amazon and they're $5 in paperback. That's not very much. So even just ordering a few to have them on hand if people would like to read and discuss it.
Good.
Right.
Okay, I can do that too, Amy. That would be great. And it is free on Gutenberg.org. But yeah, I love that idea. Let's do that.
Yeah, not everybody wants to read electronically. I have dry eyes and it's harder on me. I'd rather read paper.
Yeah, me too. I like the book.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Let's do that.
Okay. Thank you so much for bringing this, Jean.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's, man, this, I try to tell everybody I know this book. I made my students read it. And
yeah, I'm thinking Christmas presents for the women in my family.
Right.
Great idea, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Cool. Okay, any?
Question, what about children and the children, who are the current
That's a
people
good question.
alive?
I don't know. So I'll have to do some research on that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as far as I read, she didn't have grandchildren, but I'll look it up and see what I can find out. But I know that her daughter worked with her on abolitionist things and helped her with the schools.
Did you ever say on tape how she was reconciling the kids?
How she was reconciled?
Yeah.
Yeah, the father, who was the young lawyer, bought them. Once she was gone, then her master didn't care. He was just using the kids to pressure her. Mm-hmm. And so then he was like, oh yeah, okay, I don't care, you can have them. And so he sold them to their father, and then the father's white wife didn't like that, and so he sent the kids to New York to be with their mother. But you know, at least he was decent enough to do that. He wasn't any kind of hero, but so
Awful.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, Jean.
Thank you. I'll see you next week, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.